Well, welcome. I am Dr. Andrew Whiskeyman. I'm a professor at the National Defense University's College of Information and Cyberspace and a non-resident fellow with GNSI. Welcome to the GNSI Speaker Series. Here with me is retired Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan. Sir, welcome. Pleasure to have you here chatting.
Thanks.
We're here as not only part of the Speaker Series, but the backdrop of the summit on AI and strategic competition. And you have an extensive background in uniform and out of uniform, thinking about technology, the application of technology, its relations to national security, to the operational level. And so definitely an honor to have you here for a few minutes as we talk through artificial intelligence and its application to strategic competition. And so I really want to explore that a little bit, but I wanted to give you an opportunity if you had anything you wanted to open with to kind of set the context of what we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So thanks so much. I call this a twofer to do this on the heels of just finishing up the panel for this GNSI event, a 3-4 day event just on AI and these big issues about strategic competition. So I guess what I'd start with is just I never expected to find myself in this position. 36-year military career. First half of that was in fighter aviation. Then I did intelligence. I did command and control. I did time or sentence in the Pentagon, depending on how you want to talk about that. And then in my last 5 years is when I got handed this thing called artificial intelligence. And it was just such an incredible, fascinating journey that I never expected to be in. I embraced it, as hard as it was. I embraced it because those of us who got into this at the time saw the potential for this to be, and I'm going to be a little dramatic here, but it's intentional, to be a history-changing technology. And that may take 50 years to play out. Who knows? But it felt like we were going to change the future of the Department of Defense. Bold as that may sound, and it started slowly, but that's how I ended up in this position in 36 years, and now another 4 on top of that after retiring.
And I know about 30 minutes or so for a podcast is barely enough time to get to this. So I really want to focus on a couple of areas to sort of tease out and play with, and we can see where the conversation goes from there. Particularly when it comes to new domains. I know I've done a lot of research into this. There's a rhetoric and a reality between the two. And I know you had mentioned this on the panel as well. Where does AI fit into that? There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of, it's sort of the utopian view and the dystopian view. Where do you assess we are with AI right now in terms of competition?
That's well said. To me, there is this dichotomy of views. There is this messianic almost like view of AI is going to save humanity, just get out of the way and let's go develop. It's almost a technological deterministic view of this. There's also the pessimists, the doomsayers that say this will be the end of humanity as we know it if this is left unchecked. Not surprisingly, I guess I am squarely in the middle of those two. I'm very practical and realistic. And I go back to how AI got started. Alan Turing, and then the famous 1956 Dartmouth Conference on AI with John McCarthy. And they had a vision that did not come to reality, even though they thought it would take 6 months to a year, and we'll do this thing called AI. So over those intervening decades, we've seen a cycle. AI optimism, which I would call AI summers, and deep pessimism, which is AI winters. To me, it feels like today we will not have another AI winter. I'd say somewhat tongue-in-cheek, we might see some AI falls where it gets a little chilly at times, but the summer's going to come back, the spring and the summer, because it is moving so fast. We now have this combination of data, compute, models, research and development, the human piece of it. It is so much different now than just 20 years ago, and it really feels like to me and a lot of others that we're on this hockey stick curve now, that we're about to shoot up. Now we have to start worrying, well, what does that look like? But I'm a very practical person. If you were to come into the Department of Defense and say, show us your magic AI, you would walk away generally underwhelmed because it is not that fancy yet. On the other hand, it was always a vision for us as it will get there. But you've got to sort of keep that faith, that vision in mind that we're going to keep plowing away at this. Even though it's not going to happen overnight. It may not happen in 5 years. Maybe it's 10 years. Maybe it's 15 years. But stay on the path. That's what I feel like today.
Do you think some of the hype impedes that in terms of expectation management at times with senior leaders or decision makers or those that have to apply resources to stay the course?
No doubt about it. So you said something, and I did mention this on the panel, and so did Sky Moore, my fellow panelist, this rhetoric-reality mismatch. It's hard to deal with today because if I'm a senior leader in the national security enterprise and I've never done AI before, I don't know what to believe. The rhetoric says this, the reality is completely different. I can always tell that somebody in the national security enterprise has either done an AI project or has not done an AI project. Because if you've done one, you know how hard it is to get going and how many things you have to tackle to try to get to that fancy AI technology on the far end of it. And that's the infrastructure. That's the data management. That's what does compute look like? Where do we get compute? Who manages the data? What does the data pipeline look like? So there is a danger here that the talking points don't match the reality. They've clearly seen that over the past 5 years, back to my early Project Maven days. On the other hand, despite the fact that the government is known for moving slowly, I would say when I come back and look at the forest and I'm no longer buried in those trees, I see a lot of progress has happened in those 7 years since we stood up Project Maven. It needs to go faster, fully acknowledge that, but it is a different world today than it was 7 years ago. And the good news is we're spending more time educating and training senior leaders, middle management, and to some extent, sort of that tactical user. But the tactical user comes prepared for this future. They grew up in this future. They're sort of digital natives to begin with. Much easier to get their buy-in because they're actually thirsting for it. They want people to move faster. So it really is more of a focus on that middle management and also that senior leader to be convinced this is real, but it's a lot of hard work to get to that fancy video that shows somebody walking down the street in Tokyo that is unbelievably realistic looking.
That really is amazing.
It's stunning, yeah.
Especially as that ties into the information fight in terms of what's believable and what's not, which would be a whole other thread to go down. But focusing on this kind of staying the course bit, where do you see some practical areas that we could do that to make some meaningful assessments, if you will, to help particularly within the Department of Defense? We can go a little bit broader than that as we think about strategic competition, but particularly within the DoD. Besides Project Maven and where do you see some other opportunities for the department?
So I used to say this, and I really haven't changed the way I talk about this. I say that, in my opinion, AI can improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of every single thing the Department of Defense is involved in, from undersea to outer space and everything in between, to include the electromagnetic spectrum in cyberspace. I do believe that. Now, back to this rhetoric-reality mismatch problem. The so-called low-hanging fruit is not very headline-grabbing. It's business process automation. It's how do we do financial audits better in the Department of Defense? We got a lot of attention for not being able to do audits. Well, AI is now helping with that. It's medical. We were working on a project in the JAIC to take these pathology center slides and digitize them and then use deep learning against that to be able to detect in advance potential pandemics or coronaviruses of the future. Personnel system management. How do I start taking people who want to do this, but there's a need for that over there? How do I balance that out? These are not the things that get most of the attention, but I do believe that idea of cognitive assistant is where the initial focus should be. And the more you get experience on these lower risk, lower consequence use cases, you will feel more and more comfortable about moving up to the higher risk, higher consequence use cases, which are things like putting models on sensors and platforms, mostly intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, but at some point weaponized platforms. So there is a big step that you have to go through, a number of steps to go through to go from process automation, which is capable of happening right now today. Thousands and thousands of examples that should be tackled today on process automation. And then everything you learn from that, you start moving into the more consequential use cases. And that's the approach we took in Maven, and that's the approach we kept taking in JAIC to get into the platforms and sensors and predictive maintenance. A very simple use case is I want to know, with as much probability as you can give me, say 90%, 95%, 96%, if that helicopter engine is going to fail in the next X number of flights. Unbelievably important thing to know, but doesn't fit in that sort of rhetoric of here come the killer robots. So right. There's more happening behind the scenes on those projects than people realize, even though the attention tends to go for the more dramatic uses.
Yeah, it's interesting as you mentioned the killer robots. Personally, I've studied a lot of air power, spent a lot of time in Air Force schools, and I look at the narratives that came on in the early days of flight, and I see a lot of similarities in terms of how long it took us to progress at times, staying the course. Is AI a different domain? Does it fall in cyber? Does it need its own? Is it that different that we need to apply deeper thinking to the implications as opposed to just leaving it to the other branches, if you will?
That's an excellent question, and I'm going to hedge my answer a little bit. I think historic analogies are always useful because I love aviation, by the way, and everything.
I'm surprised by that.
No,
Sorry.
no, and so here's why. In addition to what you said, there's this idea of accident rates in aviation, military and commercial, were horrendous for the first 50 years of flight. Horrendous. They're stunningly low today. Why? Oversight, regulation, education, training, certification. I get in an airplane today, I have no questions about that airplane landing safely. That was not the case in 1950 or so. So I actually think there are some useful analogies here. Now, the difference is, of course, not every historical analogy is perfect. And so it falls apart in some case. And in this case, I think this is where I come from. I look at it more, AI is more like, say, electricity or networks. It's everywhere. This technology will be diffused in every part of society and the national security enterprise. So I'd rather treat it as almost like a network or electricity, which also, by the way, there was no Department of Electricity when electricity came into the military. They just ended up focusing on how do I take steam and turn it into electric, or coal at the time, and turn it to electric power. That took a while. That didn't happen overnight. But by the time you got to 1940 and 1941, beginning of the war, electricity was just considered to be part of the fabric of the department's warfighting capabilities. And to me, that's more like we stood up the Jake and Maven because that wasn't happening, because they weren't, the services were not moving fast enough, so they needed a push. They needed the enabling functions that could come from us. They needed the compute, they needed the tools, they needed the funding. Once that gets going, I actually think CDAO today could step out of the way, keep focusing on the policy, the test and evaluation, what we call red teaming, but let everything else happen down at the user level, at the service level, at the commander level. So I like the analogy. I don't want to see an AI domain. I think we've run out of domains. We got cyber, we got space. Enough. It's all there. But AI has to be viewed as being part of everything we do, every part of the domain. There will be an AI application.
Could be a nano domain, but that's a whole separate technology. So move down a different discussion. So that's within the department. We do have a Department of Energy, though. That's an outgrowth of sort of the complexities of energy, especially nuclear. Mm-hmm. Is there room in the government, perhaps, for something more focused at a department level, not within just the DoD, but at a department? Given what you've mentioned about how AI it infuses potentially everything that we are doing, from the energy sector to safety to the FAA to the spectrum. Any thoughts on?
Yeah, the fact that you said DOE, I was surprised. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised that DOE started taking more and more of a leading role in AI. DOE, but they were ready for it. They were moving. Maybe they didn't initially move as fast as DoD, but my guess is they're moving very fast with it today because there's so much applicability. First of all, you look at the compute that's available to the Department of Energy. The national labs have more compute than the planet, anywhere else on the planet. So maybe some opportunities there as well. But also places like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, central role in coming up with an AI risk management framework, 1.0. It's excellent. I've read through it, every word in there. It's very, very good. The Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, they're trying to kind of corral where the government is going with AI. So I think what we'll see is lead roles in different aspects of AI, but it won't be AI just for AI's sake. Department of Energy will look very carefully and say, how can we get better sources of energy using AI? How does green energy become more green by using AI? Treasury will say, well, we've got to figure out money laundering problems. Department of Commerce will say, we have supply chain issues we've got to think about. AI can help with that. Not just supply chains for AI, but AI used to understand global supply chains, which have become so incredibly complex. No human by themselves can understand those supply chains. So I think what we're seeing over the next couple of years, supported by this White House executive order on AI, is to coalesce all the agencies and organizations of the federal government around this topic. And different organizations, agencies will take different pieces, but somewhere there does sort of have to be this Uber person, and maybe that's in OSTP right now or somewhere in the National Security Council staff.
There are some, I think that's absolutely fascinating in terms of a U.S. federated approach, if you will, to picking up within a particular department specialty or niche area of focus and then working together which I would offer. I think the U.S. does very well when we have a common crisis or a
Yes.
common framework
Agree.
of working together forward.
I think that's such a central point that I do worry sometimes that it will take a crisis to drive us faster and better. Because right now it's still, how do you explain to the average American the importance of AI when the rhetoric is saying one thing, but day to day they're hearing something entirely different, including does their job go away? What does it mean
Right.
to an individual personally? So it's hard to explain. People want to say moonshot, but moonshot was tangible. I look out, I see that thing 240,000 miles away, and within 10 years, we're putting a man on the moon. How do you say that with AI? That's what's difficult for the average American to get their arms around. What does that really mean? We have to do better at that as a government, not just national security enterprise, to convince people this is good for the country and why it's good. And where the negative pieces are, we've got to put guardrails in place to account for the bad pieces of it as well.
And speaking of bad pieces, that's a good pivot point to think about our competitors at a strategic level. They may or may not have a similar focus or a similar way of thinking about the use of artificial intelligence to better society in a way, or at least within the vision that we have as a Western nation, a liberal democracy. What are your thoughts about the way China and Russia, perhaps as the next two, are approaching this vis-a-vis the U.S., and where are some potential challenges that we may have with dealing with their approaches to this?
Yeah, I think we will always have our concerns that they will not take the same responsible approach that in general that we're going to take in the United States in our partners. And those partners are in the West, they're in the East, Indo-Pacific, they're in Europe, they're in Africa. We've come up with a way of thinking about AI that is centered around responsible AI, that AI ethics principles matter, test and evaluation matters. As I said on the panel, we're not always going to get this right. I do not want to pretend that we are flawless in the national security enterprise. However, we are grounded in this idea of responsible AI. I'm very, very deeply skeptical that Russia will take that same approach, especially when they're in this fight now against Ukraine, willing to use whatever it takes if they think they're going to win. China's an interesting use case. I think on the civil side, the civilian side, they have put regulations in place. But their interesting part in China is the average citizen seems to be more concerned about companies using their private data than the government is, where in the United States, it's like the government, get out of our way. Companies do whatever you want with their data. A little concerning there. But what I don't know is how the People's Liberation Army will view this. And my assumption has to be they're going to move quickly. They know that they're in a fight against the United States in this competition of AI. And I do worry that they're not going to take that same approach that we're taking. And what do you have if they're not going to do it? It will force us perhaps to engage in a race to the bottom with AI. That's in nobody's best interest across the world. I would love to see their systems not work, but I don't want to see their systems fail in a way that kills innocent people, causes civilian casualties, collateral damage, and then AI is shut down globally. So we do have conversations at the unofficial non-government track 2 level is what they call it, saying we really are serious about responsible AI, and here's why we're serious. We're not going to tell you any details. I would love to hear what they're doing. They're not going to reveal their details either. But this is something we have to keep scratching on a little bit, because if not done the right way, then I fear these systems will be used in irresponsible ways just to try to get first mover advantage as opposed to being a fast follower.
Do you see any analogies with the kind of the development of nuclear weapons and the spread of nuclear technology and that of AI? And I say that because I completely agree with your point. There's, analogies can be useful. They can also be misleading if you're applying a poor analogy to a situation to learn from. The reason I pick on nuclear is, are there potentially AI deserts out there? I mean, there's a significant amount of compute power that's required. There's a significant amount of data that you require. You have to store that data. There's an energy requirement to that. Does that push certain nations out of an ability to tap into what's being gained by this, and potentially sets up even more of a disparity in the world, or a market for those that are like what's happening with 5G, for instance, with China's engagement?
No question about it. No question about it. And this is where the United States should have a substantial advantage against our adversaries. Why? Because we can partner with those countries. There are undeniably disadvantaged small countries out there that look at the United States and say, that's good for you to talk about AI. Our data, who knows where our data is? We have no compute to speak of. These companies now are talking about buying 250,000 GPUs, graphics processing units. These countries have never seen 10 GPUs. So how do we partner with those countries? And there's two ways to do it. One is on the civilian side, kind of like that National AI Institute of Resource and Research, I'll get it wrong, NAIRR, which is giving smaller companies the opportunity to get the benefit of this big compute that the big companies have, doing it through the United States government, sharing the compute basically. But I think on the national security side, we could look at something similar too. Look at our allies and partners around the world and say, we're in this together. You need help. You don't have these models. We'll help you with the models. But you also have some really interesting data from your part of the world. Could we partner on that and build some models that are good for you, but also could be used by others? So I think this is a potential strategic advantage for us, is working with others, not just the standard one, not just the UK, the Five Eye partners or Australia, whatever, but smaller countries that have gone digital very quickly. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that are interested in moving quickly and getting AI in, but don't have all the resources that the United States brings to bear. And the last point I'll make on this is actually one that can be somewhat alarming, is our companies that are so big have begun to take on this role almost like a sovereign state. We have to get that under control. What are those limits of who they're going to work with? If you have business in China, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to talk about what that business is and what they're doing with your data, with your intellectual property, and they're getting a strategic advantage by working with you when we, as a United States government, says we prefer that not to happen. We have got to wrestle that to the ground right now. It's a big, big concern with these companies that aren't used to having those conversations because it's a free market. Well, industrial policy now becomes something that we have to talk about.
And another point in history with large companies back in the early days of really expansive sea power, if you look at the models, the tension between a corporation and a nation state, and what does that look like, and how does that play out today in the digital age? Pulling the thread just a little bit more on the sort of computing at the edge, or AI at the edge. Are we at a limit right now in terms of some of the desire? And I mean that by, let's take some military operations. I can see what AI can do to me to assist as a commander. I'm at a company, a battery, a wing level, and I want that. But getting that to where I'm at, it was mentioned in the panel earlier, just on the bandwidth issues, the compute power issues. Should we sort of limit where we apply AI at the moment from a DoD perspective, from an expectation management, or are we need to keep the gas on, so to speak, and keep figuring out ways to open bandwidth and to open compute power further down the line?
The next big breakthrough needs to be, and I believe will be, AI at the edge. But a lot of work has to be done to get there. And in fact, the reason we were doing what we were doing in Project Maven and the Jake was we were using it kind of in the processing workstations back in the United States because we couldn't. The size, weight, and power constraints that existed just 5 years ago wouldn't allow us to do that at the tactical edge. I am now staying closely attuned to what's going on, and I see some companies that are coming up with creative engineering solutions to get that. Some of it's compression techniques, some of it is just a different way of building an AI model, but this will have to be the next big breakthrough, or else, here's what's going to happen. Somebody fields this wonderful AI model, let's just say a computer vision model. If you do not update that model in, say, the first 6 months, you might as well not field it in the first place. So you have to build in this idea of continuous integration, continuous deployment, or delivery, CI/CD. Not something that the national security enterprise has really thought a lot about, and yet is how every single commercial software business that is successful operates every single day. That has to be dealt with, or else we're going to be in trouble. Because the users will get jaundiced, they'll get frustrated, it's not working for me, you push this on me, I want to see what it can do, but you're telling me there's no update to be had. So there does need to be some breakthroughs in this area, and I think they're coming. And I think that we'll see them actually sooner rather than later, but then we'll have to figure out how do you scale those across the entire national security enterprise.
I want to stay zoomed in for one more minute before we kind of zoom back out to the competition piece. And pulling the thread on the learning at the edge. I know I've been involved in projects of, you're at the edge of something, but people coming in as replacements or taking over have not had the operational experience. It's not in the schoolhouse. It's not in the wargaming and the training aspects of things. How do we pull some of that, of what we're learning operationally, on that cutting edge, and bring it back into the institutional side of things to get after that workforce development piece? I know we talk about digital natives. Some of that might be an assumption. It'd be a whole different conversation in terms of where to go. But how do you see that kind of working to get the whole engine flowing?
Well, I just love that question because I have a very real example of this. So to come to in 30 seconds or less. But from my flying background, I used to look up and say, I am disconnected from whatever big Air Force is saying is going to happen in the world and what I'm dealing with day to day in my operational unit. My job was to focus on weapons and tactics in that unit. Whatever grand things were coming down 5 years from now was not my concern. I think we're seeing some of that in AI as well, except those timelines are going to be compressed more and more. And the example I will give you is we feel one of the first models we fielded, the computer vision model, we put it out in a combat theater. And we tried to give that to the intel analysts halfway through their deployment. Their reaction was, I don't want it. Nobody told me this was coming. I'm very comfortable with my process, most of which is manual, but I'm very comfortable with it. And nobody trained me on this thing. Big lesson we learned from that one was bringing it back into the spin-up training. And it was a SEAL unit. So the commander of the SEAL said, we'll figure this out. And we did. Prior to deployment, let's start playing around with this and figure out what to do. That has to happen. Now, institutionally, I think you're also bringing in something that is equally germane, which is now that we've learned these lessons from the field, get those people back in and work with the technology developers. The idea of cross-functional teams, which was at the core of everything we did in both Maven and Jake. So it is designers, developers, testers, acquirers, lawyers, and users together from the beginning in a minimal viable product approach. You will not succeed without users being involved in that process early. That hasn't happened with a lot of our hardware technology in the past. Like, hey, we know how to build technology. Thanks very much. You'll love what we give you. That's not happening with AI models today. They've got to be in this process. And then you bring in the last, I think, essential piece of this was the education and training. Bring those lessons learned, have those people transmit their lessons to the broader institutions, have the broader institutions figure out more and more what do we need to be teaching and training and certifying people different. Defense Acquisition University actually has some really interesting work going on about certifying people at different levels for different kinds of AI skills. Like you're an AI professional master, or you just need enough to oversee an AI project, which is under your system program office or SPO.
One last question before I turn over to you for any closing comments you want to wrap up or sort of leave our audience with thinking. And it's the idea of asymmetric advantage. In all warfare, you want to have an advantage over your adversary. And it's always an asymmetric approach. So it's not just a buzzword piece. But in this space, given the fact that so much is from the commercial sector, so much of the research and development is for profit, is the corporations you mentioned earlier, how does the U.S. maintain an edge in this with strategic competition when that's the space and that's the model? We're not developing things necessarily in secret and holding it back. How do you maintain that asymmetry when you're in the open? Any thoughts on that?
I do, and we have to get used to the fact that this may be ephemeral. These advantages may be fleeting. It'll be very temporal constrained. Why? Because most of this technology is open source. Now, the U.S. and its adversaries are going to do things sort of behind closed doors that are classified. But even on classified projects, if it's based on AI, generally I think it's not too hard to figure out what that AI model might be doing. So you will have an advantage, but that advantage is going to be fleeting. And so to me, this is a core central part of the fight of the future is the side that is capable of updating faster than the other side can maintain that asymmetric advantage and keep your adversary off guard. We don't have time to get into the details of the OODA loop, but the orientation phase and all the things that go with that, to me, that's what this is about. Throwing your adversary off balance, causing friction in there, causing these tightly coupled, tightly aligned feedback, friction, all these things with this orientation phase basically blows up for your adversary, but you keep on path. So this idea of moving faster than your adversary, that's what we have to build in place. And it doesn't exist that way today because it is such a different world on the software side than we're used to doing on the hardware side. And the last thing I'll say on this is very closely related to that is coming up with new operating concepts. And this includes, by the way, not just operating concepts, but bureaucratic reform. Organizations will have to change their design if you really accept that AI is going to be that transformational, and I do. And it may take a few years because you don't know what to change it to if you've never played around with these technologies. So this idea of updating faster than your adversary, changing the way you're organized, and then coming up with creative operating concepts that keeps your adversary off guard is going to be successful. Now, it's war. All bets are off when the war happens. The adversary definitely gets a vote. You're going to do strange things nobody expected. They're going to do it. It's off to the races. But I think those are the core points right now.
You just identified two more things: that element of war, the fog and the friction, the life it takes of its own. Boyd, we could spend a whole.
Yeah.
I think there's like 8 or 9 separate discussions or podcasts we could go over with that. Hopefully, this goes viral like a K-pop song or a Swiftie push, and we get invited back to do another one because I'd love to have conversations with all of those with you, sir. But we're coming up on time for this, so I want to give you the last word. Anything that we haven't talked about you want to leave the audience with, or any points you want to really kind of hammer home for folks to be thinking about at this inflection point we are now?
I would say that first, thank you for allowing me to come in and doing this. It's important. And I hope we have an opportunity to do more of them. I don't know. I'm not Travis Kelce, but if you're a Swiftie, we'll figure out what that might look like. But to me, I believe we are on the cusp of something different. I've written about this, and I write somewhat dramatically, and I promise you not everybody agrees with this. I believe we're on the cusp of a third revolution. You had the agrarian revolution, you had the industrial revolution. I don't see this as a fourth industrial revolution. I see it different than that. I think it's this combination of humans, machines, and data that goes well beyond symbiosis. But on the other hand, I have no idea what that's going to look like. The historians will be the ones that look back and say, okay, it began here. But I believe we are in a very different time. And we're seeing the outlines of it, but it's unknowable and unpredictable where it leads us in the next decade, 20, 30 years, because it relies on the decisions of many millions of people that decide this technology is good, it's bad, how we use it, how we don't use it, and so on. But what I would say, I guess my closing comment would be, stay positive and optimistic, but accept the reality is it's not where we think it should be yet. You just got to keep working on it. But to me, if we don't do this, then our adversary is going to do it. And your point about asymmetry is well taken. Historically, it's proven. The side that has the asymmetric advantage will have an advantage on the battlefield or today in the battle space. So I stay optimistic, but I'm also very realistic. I am enthusiastic about the future. I don't get caught up in the sentient, sapient discussions. I'm like, okay, we're a long way from that. But on the other hand, we have to have people that work this day in, day out. Think very carefully about the consequences of this technology. And at least in the national security enterprise, I actually feel pretty good about that piece of it.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks for the comments, for taking some time to share your thoughts with us, and for being yet another edition of the GNSI Summit
Thank
series.
You, Andy. Thanks very
Speaker
much.
Series.
Really
Thanks.
enjoyed it. Thanks.
Absolute pleasure. So thank you all for joining us on the GNSI Speaker Series with retired Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan. What an amazing, amazing discussion we just had. So tune into the next one as well. Thanks.